I'm Amanda Rose Schellenberg with Investment Pitch Media, here today to speak to the Right to Grow advocacy group made of dentistry professionals, advocates, researchers, and patients who are looking to seek change in the orthodontics community. I'm here with Omar Leilani, the founder of the organization. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit why you wanted to start the Right to Grow and what you're doing in the community.
Sure. It starts back to when I was a kid. So when I was 11 years old, I had a growth stunting appliance that I wore at night called a cervical headgear, and it was designed to stunt the growth of my upper jaw to let my lower jaw catch up. And what happened is, months after wearing it, I started waking up really tired. I started being late for school. I started brushing my teeth and washing my face at school. I started napping during class. I started not being able to do morning sports. And this kind of mapped out my whole life until 2 years ago when I woke up one morning and I could not see. My vision was totally blurred. I could barely move. And called a doctor, went to the hospital, and they said, you know what, Omar, you choke 76 times an hour during your sleep. You have pretty bad case of obstructive sleep apnea, so you're not getting the oxygen you need, you're not getting the rest you need. I wonder why you're so tired. And I said, well, why do I have that? And they said that your airway is a quarter the size it should be. Your upper jaw is too far back, and it's trapping your lower jaw. So then I started to think, well, when I was a kid, I wore cervical headgear, which was designed to stunt the growth of my upper jaw. I then spent the next 2 years, literally every weekend and night I had spare at the university library, I read every paper I could find on cervical headgear, going back to the early 1900s. What I found out is that cervical headgear was known to stunt the growth of the upper jaw, which is what its whole purpose is, but that when that happens, all the structures between the spine and the upper jaw also get stunted. What's between the spine and the upper jaw? The airway. It's the most precious piece of real estate on the planet, the human airway. You live without food for days, without water for days, without air, minutes, right? And so what I've found out is that we have an industry that is relying on using the space of the airway to create room for teeth, pull teeth back, pull bones back to make the teeth look good. But they are squishing the airway. And so I'm here to say that that now has to stop. Growth stunting, was done, it's been done for centuries. It was banned in China, stunting of growth of women's feet through foot binding.
So you expressed a little bit about your story, about having headgear yourself, and I almost can think that every single person who's watching this video is probably thinking to themselves, well, I had headgear, or, Tommy had headgear. So how many people do you think have actually been affected with this phenomenon?
I'd say hundreds of millions, if not billions. So stats in orthodontics show that about a third of the world has had orthodontic treatment at some point in their lives. And today, at any given time, 80% of US teens are having orthodontic treatment. The bulk of orthodontic treatment is retractive in nature. What is retractive? Pulling back, pulling teeth back, pulling the bones back.
Right.
So if you look at this diagram here of the human skull from underneath, see that hole there? That is a carotid canal. Through that hole, you have the carotid artery. That is arguably the most important blood flow pathway in the human body. It feeds blood to the brain.
So what does it do when it's pushed back?
Good question. It hasn't been studied. So we are stunting the growth. We're applying bone squishing forces through the entire skull on every structure between the spine and the upper jaw. That includes the airway, that includes the carotid canal, but we haven't studied whether or not the carotid canal is getting squished. But what's the weakest point in the structure? The hole, the holes. So are we straightening kids' teeth at the expense of their blood flow? Right now, we don't know. And if you're going to go do a medical experiment to find out, who would consent to that experiment? Number two, the airway. The airway is right there between the spine and the upper jaw. And if you're pulling the upper jaw back, the only reason you can pull it back is because you have an airway to pull it back into. So hundreds of millions of people on the planet, if not billions, have had some form of stunting of their airway. And if you look at the face of modern man, you'll see it's very different than prehistoric man. Prehistoric man's jaws were bigger. Their
Right.
faces were more forward
When you
grown.
think of the Neanderthal.
Yes,
Yep.
yeah.
So on your website,
Yeah.
you have research on reverse growth patterns that are associated with headgear dating back almost 100 years.
Yeah.
So what is the research telling us?
The research tells us that when you stunt the growth of the upper jaw, you cause what they had a word for it in the early 1900s, and it was called upper respiratory dysfunction or upper respiratory disorder. They didn't call it sleep apnea then, but what they found is that kids who had cramped maxillas became mouth breathers. And what they also found is that the muscle patterns associated with chronic mouth breathing tend to flatten the face and flatten the airway. And the studies talk about kids who have trouble in school, who lose time, people who lose time at work. The studies in the early 1900s talk about debilitating consequences, disastrous consequences. They talk about side effects that wreak havoc on health. So a cramped maxilla, I wouldn't wish it on anybody, because the nasal airway is right behind the maxilla. So if you pull the maxilla back, you are pulling it back into the airway.
And that's what you're getting with
And
those.
exactly. Or if you pull teeth out, let's say you pull your two upper teeth out, you then have to pull front teeth back to close the gaps.
Right.
So now you've reduced the reduced the volume of the oropharynx. Where does the tongue go? The tongue doesn't stop growing if you pull teeth out. Now the tongue goes back into the airway.
Right.
If you look at this picture of twins, so John Mew was Dr. John Mew in the UK was one of the pioneers of forward face growth for kids, and he developed a way to help the face grow forward rather than pulling teeth back. This is a way to create space and help the lower jaw grow out. And he did a landmark study on twins, one using retractive and extractive methods, so pulling structures back, and the other helping structures grow forward. And you look at the results, the way the face looks, it's dramatic.
See it.
And
You know,
then
I think the image that you're speaking of, I saw it on your website.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Bill Hang is another pioneer in this field called orthotropics, which is forward face growth. And if you look at his video here, you can see what he refers to, and people have been referring to for decades as the headgear effect. The headgear effect is a flattening of the face. And the studies show this, that when you use a headgear on a kid and you pull the upper jaw back, you cause it to grow down and back, and you cause the lower jaw to grow down and back as well. So the whole face is being flattened. And orthodontists who wrote these studies, these are peer-reviewed studies, they talk about disastrous consequences on respiration, which we talked about, but also on posture. And so what happens to a kid when their airway is pulled back, or their jaws are pulled back into their airway, is that they tend to sit like this and stand like this, and it's called forward head posture. Forward head posture keeps the airway open. When a kid who has, is living with the headgear effect, has a flattened face, if they were to stand straight, their airway would kink off like a garden hose, and so they slouch forward. So that's another consequence.
So we talked a lot about the problem. So what are some treatment solutions that are offered in the industry that could help combat some of these issues that pop up?
Maxillary expansion. Helping the arches grow to accommodate the teeth. When you expand the maxilla, you expand the airway. So studies talk about that. They talk about expanding the maxillas, helping a kid breathe better.
So sounds like there is a bit of hope.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There's orthotropics. There's the alpha appliance. There's tons and tons of alternatives which facilitate growth rather than stunt growth.
And we can go to your website to find out more information?
Yep. Website is righttogrow.org.
Perfect.
And we don't talk too much about alternatives there. Mainly talk about the research there, but you can just search online, you'll find lots of stuff.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
your website, The Right to Grow,
Yeah.
it talks a little bit about the 1959 Declaration of the Rights of the Child. And it talks about Principle 2 that states that each child has the right to develop physically, mentally, morally, spiritually, and socially in a healthy and normal manner.
Yeah.
Yeah, so how does Right to Grow support this declaration and this principle?
Well, every kid, so, the countries of the UN got together in 1959 and at some point in the 80s got together and said, look, every kid has a right to their normal growth. It also says that the countries that signed that treaty must abolish traditional practices that are prejudicial to the health of the child. We've known for 100 years that stunting the growth of the upper jaw is prejudicial to the health of the child. And so we're calling for the abolishment of these ancient and archaic practices.
Tell me, Omar, what do you hope your viewers to do today after watching this video?
We'd like them to do two things. Number one, go to our website, go to righttogrowth.org, and sign our petition, number one. Underneath Take Action, you'll see the petition. Our petition will go out to lawmakers, and we're pressing to have a ban on these practices. Number two, go to GoFundMe and fund our campaign to make a documentary film. So we're going to make a documentary film which will explain all of this. It'll go out to the public. We need to raise about $1 million to $1.5 million. So write us a check. It'll go to good use, and you can go watch the movie.
Thank you so much, Omar, for coming in and sharing a little bit about this cause and the work that you're doing within the orthodontics community. It certainly enlightened me, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers out there, so thank you.
Thank you, too.
I'm Amanda Rose Schellenberg with InvestmentPitch.com.